Welcome to The Jewish Lens, a podcast to discuss anything and everything from a Jewish perspective. Now, please help me welcome the man who controls the media, your host, Jonathan Rosen.
And today I am joined by someone who I've gotten to know and become friendly with. He has a fascinating story and has had an incredible journey and redemptive arc. Once led the National Socialist Movement, which was once the largest neo-Nazi group in the United States, and he's currently a consultant and speaker for the Simon Wiesenthal Center, and he also heads his own nonprofit, Beyond Barriers, which is dedicated to countering extremism. Please help me welcome Jeff Schoep. I hope I'm pronouncing that right?
Yes. Yeah. Thanks for having me, Jonathan.
Well, thanks for joining me. So I want to start out with, like I said at the beginning, I've gotten to know you a little. And for those who don't know, where did you grow up and what was your family life like?
So I grew up in rural Minnesota, average working class, blue collar family, middle class later on in our time and pretty basic everyday life. It's pretty normal growing up. But I had this fascination with my mother was a German immigrant, my grandparents were German immigrants, and I had this fascination with my
and they grew up in Germany during the war era, right? I mean, you had family that actually served in Germany, Nazis in Germany.
Yes.
And so where did that fascination, how did you first find out about this, and was it talked about in the house?
Well, there was German always being spoken in my grandparents' house, and so I knew about it growing up, and the fascination started in around like fourth grade because I knew, and I have to say this with a caveat because I knew my grandfather fought in the war, the soldier and all that, but it wasn't something that was promoted in our household or in our grandparents' household. It wasn't something that he was proud of. In fact, when I was very young, I was told not to ask too many questions because I was one of those kids that asked a lot of questions, and so in a way, I guess you could say it was a forbidden fruit in some ways, like I wasn't able to ask a lot of questions. As I got older, I would ask more questions and hear war stories and things like that, which was mainly the fascination for me was, being a soldier and fighting in the war and
But they didn't start discussing Nazi policies or anything in the house or anything like that.
No, never. No, that was never discussed. And as far as I know, no one in the family line was actually a Nazi. My grandfather and great uncles fought. My grandmother and her family were from Prussia, and they lost their property and home and everything after the war because that was turned over to Poland, and Prussia was turned over to Poland after the war. So I learned, heard some stories about that and what happened to them after the war and becoming refugees, and things like that.
Well, so I've gotten to go through your memoir, and like I said, it's a fascinating read. And I've told you I do hope it gets picked up because I think it gives a great behind-the-scenes, view into a world that not many are familiar with. At what age did you start feeling, I guess, radicalized, and what were some of your thoughts that led you to start seeking this path, I guess?
So, like I said, I was starting to get fascinated with it in the fourth grade, but that was pretty young, and it wasn't anything to do with the politics. It was more the history because I've always and still am a fan of history. So history was sort of my entry point, which is a little strange, I guess, for radicalization, just to have that being the pathway in. But I wasn't really, I guess you could say, when I was radicalized was after I joined, because I joined at about around the age of 18. And around that time,
how did you first start hearing about the groups? To begin with, how did you hear about them?
See, this was back in the 90s, so I had to seek them out. It wasn't something you could just click a button like now.
Right, sure.
So I had to really seek them out, and I was purposefully seeking out the groups, and I wanted to join something that was as close to the German Nazi Party here in America. So that's what I did. Actually, I found the first list of contacts I found in the back of a book that I ordered from the library. Before that, I saw a sticker on TV for a group, and I wrote to them. It was they just flashed it on the news, and I wrote it down. But where I actually found most of the contacts was through this book, and I believe it was written by a sociologist or something, and all the organizations that participated were listed in the back of the book as participants. So I guess that was probably part of the deal. Like if you're going to participate in the subject, then we'll list your organization in the back. And so all those groups were listed. I started writing groups, and that was
But you
my
started writing into them to ask to join.
asking for information, and
Right.
then an application for some of I started with some of the Nazi groups. Then I started writing Klan groups and Christian identity groups, and basically everything that was in there. I started with what interested me the most, and then kind of worked my way down just to see what everybody was, send a couple bucks for newsletter samples or newspaper samples or whatever everybody was putting out at the time.
I mean, you sought these groups out. Is this based on like a feeling that you had, like, oh, I want to join these groups, for like, I guess white power type things, or like, or did you have like started feeling like animosity towards, like, minority groups? The same thing?
In those early days, I wouldn't say it was that much, because where I grew up, there, it was basically all white. It was all
Right.
white, and I hadn't ever met any Jewish people or anything like that. I'd read Mein Kampf. Now on the internet, it says I read the Mein Kampf in the fourth or sixth grade or some ridiculousness like that, but that's not true. I read Mein Kampf at age 16. Is when I first got a hold of it, and then I thought, and that there was a lot of anti-Semitism
Sure.
and things like that. But I'd actually never really met any Jewish people until, I think I was about 17, or just briefly met one person that I knew of that was Jewish, and
It was like a strange world, just like a thing to you.
yeah, so it was just like what I read there, in Mein Kampf, basically Hitler was blaming the Jews for
Right.
all Germany's misfortunes, and I felt like, I've heard people say, that it could be like a generational trauma thing, from like what happened to my family over there, and things like that. And then and with radicalization, you scapegoat people. You have to have somebody to blame. So, I became an anti-Semite, but I didn't really know anything about it other than reading Mein Kampf and some things like that. After I started writing the groups, now I'm getting indoctrinated. I wrote
Yeah,
Holocaust.
what was their vetting process like to let you in, I guess?
Back then, I mean, it was fairly easy. Like you could just submit an application. Some of them would just send applications in the mail and things like that. So it depended on the group, but a lot of them you could just join by mail, and there was a lot of
Hmm.
people that took advantage of those type of things. So later on, when I was running the group, I changed all that and had a more stricter vetting process.
So in a way, it almost seems like, a glorified gang, or in some bizarre variation of the word fraternity. So there was no like initiation for that, and like what did you have to do to get in? Because when I think of these things, it's like maybe it's a Hollywood creation, I guess, but it seems like there's like a violent component to the initiation. Always like you have to go prove yourself to do something, beat someone up, or break into someone's place or something in order to prove that you're taking it seriously.
No, I mean, in yes and no. I joined what you would call like an above ground organization. But there's other types. So these groups really vary across the spectrum. Where I was involved in an organization that expected you to follow the laws and
Right.
things like that, because not necessarily from a moral standpoint, but from a legal standpoint. Now there's white power gangs. There's some of the skinhead groups would have initiations, like you were getting jumped in, like some of the
Mhm.
street. Some of them would have that, not all, but some. And but your criminal type gangs, like your Aryan Brotherhood, or some of the criminal based gangs or prison based gangs, they would have some of them would have components about like committing crimes, or things like that. But that was something like in the world that I was in, the criminal element in gangs were kind of considered degenerates, and for the most part we stayed away from them.
So once you're in the group, like, so what are some of the kind of like everyday regular routines, and like what were your responsibilities when you first got in?
When you first got in, I mean, basically it's all volunteers. So I mean, you join, you pay the membership fee or whatever, and dues, and most of the groups, and you're as active as you want. I was in, you could be active or you could be less active. And I chose to be pretty active, and I was being, indoctrinated into the ideology, and I
Mhm.
was a really good recruiter. So I was bringing in quite a few people, so I moved up to the ranks pretty quickly.
So when you say they're being indoctrinated, I don't know, they give you reading material, or they just talk to you constantly about, certain things and their beliefs?
Both. I mean, I did a lot of the reading and stuff like that on my own beforehand. I'm ordering books. I'm reading everything I can get my hands on, subscribing to different newsletters from different groups and different newspapers. And also within the group, you're having that. So, I mean, if you ask questions to the leadership or, the members and things like that, it becomes an echo chamber. It's very much like a cult is the
Uh,
way I explain it now, because you're very much in this circle or this bubble, and all you're hearing is the indoctrination of the group. So even if you start questioning things, and say, well, I don't know, this doesn't really make sense. You'll have 5, 6, 10, whatever people. No,
sure.
no, no. This is why. This is why. Read this material. And then there's confirmation bias, because over here is the facts, but here is the so-called facts that they want you to read. So all of a sudden you're dismissing everything, on the one side, and you're going, this fits my narrative, so I'm gonna go with this side. And you don't do that subconsciously. It's not a conscious thing, but
Sure.
it's definitely subconscious.
But I'm sure it's like a constant pressure,
Oh, yeah.
stay tough, right? So how after you joined, how long did it take you to, I guess, start climbing up the ranks and eventually take over the National Socialist Movement?
It was relatively fast. So I started out, and I was in South St. Paul, Minnesota, and I was a local group leader there. And then we were doing street activism, and it was all over the news. And so we were marching around town with Nazi flags and in
Mhm.
uniforms and things like that. And so I was put to local group leader, and there was guys that were considerably older than me, because I was quite young. And I mean, I'm a teenager basically at this time, and 19, 18, whatever. And there was some questions about, why is this guy, being put in charge of the
Sure.
local. He doesn't have the experience we have, but the leader at the time saw something in me that felt like I fit into that role. And then eventually, within a couple of years, he says, he called me over for a meeting and said, he says, I'm going to retire, and I need somebody to take over the organization. I would like you to do that, or, are you willing? And I just remember just being like, oh my God, oh wow. It was never something I wanted or strove for. It wasn't something that I didn't even feel I was capable of it at the time. I was like, am I capable of this? I'm like 20, 21 by this time. I am I am I going to be able to do this, And he's like, I'll still be around for advice, or things like that, but I think you can do it. And reluctantly, I took on the position. I didn't. It wasn't really. The group was fairly small at the time, and I don't know that there was anybody else. I mean, there's other people that would have done it, but I don't know his reasoning. I guess I could say is,
Did
but he
the
felt
people
like
that had been there longer than you give you crap about it, or no?
a little bit, but it wasn't a democracy. Being in the NSM wasn't a democracy. There was a chain of command and things like that. So if somebody had a problem with it, I mean, they could gripe or whatever a little bit, but if it was a real issue, you could throw them out or something to that nature, or they could leave, they could resign. So yeah, there was a little bit of pushback, and at the beginning, and for a number of probably throughout the 90s. It wasn't until later in the 90s that I had like a really firm I guess stronghold on the organization. So it took some time, because there was people that, how is such a young guy doing this? Nobody's
Right.
this young has ever been in this position before. But then as the group grew and started coming up, when I joined, it was just in a handful of states. Most of the membership was concentrated in Minnesota, where we were based at the time. And then we had a few small chapters around the country. And by the time the early 2000s came around, I mean, it was all over the country, and international branches were opening up.
Right,
So
I was gonna ask you about that because you took over and the group grew exponentially after you took over. So what was it that you looked for? I mean, that the group looked for in order to recruit members? It reminds me so much of a lot of things today. You eke out these vulnerable people. So what was it that you sought to get members in?
What was it that we did specifically, or how was that? How do we?
What kind of things did you look for in a person to get new members?
Well, the blanket strategy was, just basically try to recruit all the white people that we could recruit. But
Mhm.
some people were more, I guess you could say, more prone to recruitment. If you saw like, like on a local level or something, like if you're just passing out leaflets and you're spewing propaganda and getting stuff out there, you never kind of know who's contacting you.
Right.
But you're always reading the new people that are coming in and kind of trying to vet them, because there's this hyper paranoia about infiltration, about disloyal people, and like you mentioned in the memoir, there's some stories or some examples of that, how that took place, and what took place. So it was a very hyper paranoid environment. And in the group I was in, it was mostly blue collar and working class people and poor.
Mhm.
So if, for example, once in a while somebody would come around that would be like somebody from middle class or upper middle class, or something like that, and it would come around, and most of the guys would be suspicious right off the bat because they didn't kind of fit that narrative or fit that norm of the people that are around us. Like, oh, so and so just drove up in a Corvette, they must be a Fed. Like, that was literally the kind of thinking that a lot of the people had. Or it even came down, I remember in the early days back in the 90s, where our recruits from the suburbs were hazed more, or mistreated a little bit, because they weren't like the rest of us that were in the working class neighborhoods in the poor areas of town. So it was like, oh, who are these rich kids from the suburbs? They might be Antifa, or they might be something
Right.
else. And it wasn't always true. So
It's no secret, like how these types of groups feel about Jews, other minorities. So, what was the stated, or I guess, or unstated goal or no goal of the purpose of the movement with regard to Jews? Was it to inflict violence or harassment, or meaning would the group go out at times specifically to look for violence, or was it more like a propaganda type thing to spread an ideology? Like if I had come across the group all alone somewhere, would that have been it for me? Like that type of thing.
no, no, because that would have, I mean, again, depending on the group, but the group I was involved in, you couldn't just go and attack people on the street, because you'd get in trouble for that. So like there was cases where members had committed serious crimes, and we would expel them for that. Now, after they did their time or whatever and they came back out, then you could say, well, he did the crime, now he could come back, depending on what it was. So at later on in my time there, we were doing criminal background checks and things like that, because we were finding people with like lengthy criminal records that were joining. And unless it was something like, the only thing that I can recall that we didn't allow somebody in for and is if they were a rapist or a pedophile. Any type
Mhm.
of sex crimes were not tolerated, and they were earlier on. And the reason why that rule was enacted, at first the rule was, explain to us why this is on your record, because sometimes someone can end up on those lists for walking out of a bar and taking a leak in public. So I'm going into that mindset, like, well, if their story is something like that, maybe we'll let them in. Later, a member, or a former member at the time, actually was on one of those, I won't say the show, but a national-wide TV show
Mhm.
that was going after criminals. And this was a very popular show, and this guy was on there. And even though at the time he wasn't a member, at one time he was a unit leader or a state leader, I forget, city leader, some sort of official in the party, and he was being hunted on this show, and
Wow.
the show explained he was a current member. So I remember after that, I made a directive that anybody with any sort of sex crime is not going to be allowed. I don't care what their story was.
You were basically more work as a group. It was like more pushing an ideology. You didn't want heat someone doing an actual physical crime or something like that. You didn't want that brought to you, to your doorstep.
Well, with the sex crimes, that was a public perception
Right,
thing
right.
as
Yeah.
well. and amongst the people, because it was something that we didn't tolerate. But now about other crimes, yeah, like if a member went and killed somebody or did something or some kind of violent attack, they were also a security risk in that sense, because now, and I say why I wish it was from a moral standpoint, but the reason was more of a legal standpoint, because now if you've got a member that's going out and
Right,
committing, it can blow back on the group. So
right.
that was the concern there. But again, that's my experience from the group that I was involved in.
Doesn't necessarily mean for every right. Now, so here's one of the things that hit me while reading your memoir. And since I met you, every interaction has been friendly. You've treated me with respect and courtesy. And I'm going to admit, before I first met you, I was apprehensive. I mean, because if you follow me on Twitter or any social media, being Jewish and calling out anti-Semitism is such a huge part of who I am, even more so lately. But from the moment I met you, you couldn't have been nicer. So it's difficult to reconcile between the person I see and the person I've read about. So at some point, and I'm talking before you met Daryl Davis, who I'll get to in a moment, but before you even met him, were there times where you felt conflicted that these people that you and the movement are vilifying are not the creations in your mind that you harbor animosity toward, but are like actual nice people who are just, not that different?
That's a good question. I didn't really start doubting my trajectory until around 2015, 2016, around that time. Then I started questioning things more. But before that, I was fully radicalized, and I didn't give anybody a chance. I didn't go out of my way, and any interactions I would have had with Jewish people were typically not friendly, and from my standpoint, just because I felt like through the propaganda and stuff, and I'm very ashamed and regretful of this now, obviously, and a lot of my closest friends today are Jewish, so it's really it's been a learning experience for me. But when you're that radicalized, you can't see the forest beyond the
Right.
tree. You can't see it, and I wasn't able to see it until Daryl really helped me break through, and a number of other people did as well.
So let's get back to Daryl Davis. When did you first meet him? And for those who don't know who he is, can you just tell us a little bit about him?
So I met Daryl in I believe it was 2016. Excuse me. My voice is a little hoarse. I have to apologize for that. But I met Daryl in 2016, and it was well, first of all, who is Daryl Davis? So Daryl was he's a famous musician. He played with Elvis Presley, Little Richard, Chuck Berry. He plays the piano. He sings. He's a blues and rock and roll guy. So he likes the piano, keys on fire. Really incredible musician. What he does in as a lot of times will be referred to it in the press as his hobby, is he goes and meets white supremacists, particularly Klansmen, and he has personally brought out over 200, helped over 200 Klansmen leave those organizations, including Grand Dragons, which are state leaders, and I believe even a couple Imperial Wizards, which are national clan leaders.
Yeah.
So he's incredibly, and I didn't say it, he's an African American. He's a black man.
Yes.
Yeah, it's
Yeah,
pretty
it's
impressive.
amazing. Yeah. So and when did you first meet him?
2016, around that time. He was filming for his film Accidental Courtesy. And so I didn't know I was going to meet him. And I got contacted by the producer of the film, and they said, here's this film we're working on. Would you like to appear in it? And in my role as the commander of the NSM, I would be in, different TV programs, news things, films, whatever. So typically I agreed to them. But what was different about this was I would always do due diligence. I would always look into the background of whoever I was meeting, whatever film company, to make sure it wasn't a setup or make
Right.
sure it wasn't going to be just some horrible experience that we didn't want to participate in. Most of the time I'd participate, and for whatever reason, fate, destiny, I don't know what it was, what you could call it. I'm glad I didn't, but I didn't check into the background. I just said, this sounds pretty good. I'm gonna go ahead and do this. So I went down to the filming location, and with my girl, and we're sitting outside on this bench, and out of this vehicle, this a big black man comes walking up to our bench, and he goes, "Hi, I'm Daryl Davis. You must be Jeff Schoep." And I shook his hand, and I'm like, I recognize this face from somewhere, and that name too. Where do I know this guy from? Where have I heard of him? I hadn't met him in person before, but I knew of him and I knew who he was. But it took a couple minutes. We're kind of walking in and we're just conversating, and I was like, oh crap, this is the guy that gets people out of the Klan. I should have been more prepared for this, because I would have been more. I mean, I wasn't intimidated, but I was like, I would have probably psyched myself up a little more for the
Mhm.
a debate. I was going into it thinking this is going to be a debate. This is going to be a challenge. And it was more like a conversation with two friends. And when I tried to escalate the conversation and said, we're talking and we're going on and on. And I was a musician before, when my early days, that was my dream and what I wanted to do. So Daryl and I had so much in common.
Right.
He was living the dream, that I wanted to pursue. And so we're having all this, conversation in common. And I'm thinking in the back of my head, hold on, I'm supposed to be here representing the NSM. I've got to, buckle down a little bit and not be quite so friendly, because this might look strange. So then I say some, inflammatory statement about fighting to the last bullet for my people. And usually when I would escalate my voice and say something aggressive like that, other person that I was talking against would react, and they would, they'd escalate or something, or get angry. And Daryl's demeanor did not change. His face, even his facial expressions didn't change. He was just very calm, and he was like, okay, and then just went on with the conversation. And so now I'm really enthralled in the conversation and sort of reeled in, like, how is this guy not reacting? Now I'm intrigued. And we're going on. And what it was that he particularly said that really got to me, because we're talking politics. He asked what I stood for, and he says, "Would you like to know why I do the work that I do?" I said, "Yes, of course." And he explained the story about when he was 11 years old in the Boy Scouts, and how white adults were throwing rocks at him, and
Wow.
how he had to explain to his parents what took place, and how racism affected him growing up.
That was the first person that really like disarmed you, emotionally about this.
Yes, yes, and that stuck with me, but it wasn't. It was like Daryl's sort of like Johnny Appleseed planting seeds.
Right.
For some people, maybe one, I know of some people where one experience changed their life. I was so entrenched. I would like to say that should have done it. Like that's when I was really starting to question things, but I didn't make the jump yet. I was trying to when you're radicalized, you're trying to justify the reasons to stay, and I had a lot of complexities as the leader of it as well, because I felt some responsibility for the members. I felt, my career was my business and everything was rolled up into it as well. So I had a lot of personal and extra personal outside of the personal things, like concerns about what would happen to the group, what would happen to the people in it. Would the next leader go commit acts of, encourage people to commit acts of violence? These are all things that were sort of running around in my head as excuses to stay put. So the first thing I was doing not long after that time, was trying to change the public image of the organization. I was demanding to the public, the press, call us a white civil rights organization. I know that sounds silly and laughable, because I explain it as trying to put lipstick on a pig. I was trying to dress up the Nazi party, make it look pretty, and you can put lipstick on a pig,
Right.
but
Right.
it's not going to make it pretty, right? So, but that was all psychologically stuff that was going on in my head, trying to justify it and trying to fix things. I was trying to repair it. You can't repair it, but that was how I was eventually coming to that realization, is what helped me break free of it. And a
Oh,
few.
so at what point did you start thinking that you wanted to leave the movement, and what did it take, I guess, to finally get you to go?
So I was stewing over that stuff between 2015, 2016, all the way up until the time I left in 2019. But so it was a whole combination of a bunch of different things. Not about 6 months or within a year of meeting Daryl Davis, I met a Muslim filmmaker by the name of Dia Khan. And I was one of the main characters in her film White Right Meeting the Enemy, which won a bunch of Emmys and
Mhm.
things. And getting to know her over the course of the film quite well, and what such a humanistic approach similar to Daryl Davis's. But getting to know her, and her approach was so similar to Daryl's, and how she explained to me how racism and hatred affected her as a child. And I could feel the pain. I could feel the negative energy, the energy in the air, the hurt, when she was explaining that. And that really, really affected me. And it wasn't too long after that, that I just said enough was enough. And there was other little things too, like towards the very end when I was just about ready to leave. um, I had enacted a social media policy, and this was like an unwritten rule before, like don't say
Mhm.
anything violent on the internet, don't promote violence, don't, retweet or repost or whatever, anything that has to do with violence. And I just figured it was a known thing. You didn't have to put out a policy. So I wrote up this policy, and I think this was in 2018, or it was probably 2018, because I left in March of 19. And I put out this policy on social media, and I was so angry about it, because the reason I had to do it, or I felt I had to do it, is because there was so many people that were posting things like burning down mosques and burning down synagogues and
Right.
things like, and I was like, a couple of people that were posting it were like long time, and a couple of them were sort of high ranking guys in the group. And then there was a female that was posting stuff like bomb making materials or things like that
Oh.
online. She was wanting to join, but we denied her membership.
Mhm.
And like this was all going on at once, like right around the time, just before I was leaving. And I said, you know what? If I really have to explain, and I explained to a couple of them personally, because usually I'd use the chain of command and be like, tell this guy to straighten up. But I mean, a couple of these people were people I knew, so I was quite well. So I was like, dude, why are you doing this? Well, I didn't make the meme. I just reposted it. That doesn't matter. You're still posting something terrible, or pictures of genocides or things like that. And like, it was funny. And it just came to me like, even in my trajectory where I thought I was standing up for my people and doing something good and noble, which is what most radicalized people believe that they're doing, I can't stand with people that are promoting killing or death or destruction and things like that. It doesn't sit right. It doesn't feel right. And even if I'm not advocating it and I'm trying to stamp it out like what I was doing, what does, like they say, tell me who your friends are, and that's who
Mhm.
you are. That old statement, or maybe I'm misquoting it a little bit, but you get what I'm saying, I think.
Yeah.
And I was like, I can't stand for this anymore. I can't make those excuses anymore. I can't stay with this. It would have been easier to stay because like I said, my whole life was wrapped up in it. I had a comfortable position, and what many would consider a position of power. I had a steady income, and everything else, but morally, I couldn't stand with that. And the whole reason I got involved in the first place was because I wanted to do something good and noble. I thought I was a patriot. I thought I was fighting
Right.
for my country. And now all of a sudden it's like, I'm not, I don't want to stand with people that are promoting things like that. It was too much. And all those other things. And then meeting people like Daryl and Dia and several others, and living here in Detroit, moving from Minnesota to Detroit. I was white people are the minority here, so I had met a lot of
Right.
people. And people think, over the years, most of the violence and stuff that you experienced, it must have been with Black people or Jewish people or Hispanics or something. Almost all of the violence I experienced was with other white people or with the far left, specifically.
Right. Well, but even before reading your memoir, I had read and known how difficult it is to leave these groups. You even wrote it yourself a little bit, how it's frowned upon when people left. So I can only imagine how difficult it was to someone who had led the group at one point. Did they give you a lot of trouble when you left?
Well, I anticipated that because I knew how hard it was going to be to leave. So what I did was, when I left in March of 2019, is I retired. And
Mhm.
when you're in an above ground group, you can retire, where some of the criminal groups or things might come after you. But in an above ground group, you can retire and walk away, and you still be respected and everything like that. So I retired, And I knew I was going to speak out at that time, but I didn't know quite what that was going to look like or how I was going to do that. And I wasn't quite ready because you have to process a lot, before you do those kind of things. So um, that was the most difficult period, probably the most difficult period of my entire life was that first 6 months or so after leaving. So I retired, and then so I'm hit with this like barrage of phone calls, emails, letters, come back, we need you back. Whatever you're going through, um, we're here for you. We stand with you, and this kind of stuff. And 90% of those calls and emails I was ignoring just because I couldn't, I didn't want to deal. I didn't want to hear it,
Mm.
like, what do you say what do you say to the people when you're going to leave and you're done and you're going to speak out? What are you going to say? So the only people I was talking to was, to finish up the corporate responsibilities, because the organization was a nonprofit in the state of Michigan and not a federal nonprofit, but a state nonprofit, and it was incorporated. So I had corporate responsibilities, had to, you know, turn over the group to the next leader and all those
Mm.
kind of things. So I just still talk to like the board members and a few people. But aside from that, all the others I didn't really respond to because it was too much. But when I denounced racism and started speaking out, that's when some threats and things like that started rolling in and wasn't a whole lot from like the group per se that I was in, but other um a few members, a couple few members, and then some people from outside of the group, like other independents or from other organizations or unknown.
How did you first, after you left the group, how did you first start getting involved with the Wiesenthal Center?
So when I made my public announcement in August, August or September of 2019, that I was speaking out and I launched a website. And within days of that website launching, I got an email from Rick Eaton at the Wiesenthal Center, the director of research is his
They
position.
sought you out.
Yes,
Yes.
yes.
I'm
So
sorry,
they,
go ahead. Yeah.
well, they knew who I was,
Right.
obviously from the work that they do and everything. Rick will say, he followed my career from the start as far as that goes. So, which I didn't know that when he reached out, but I did know that they were what I knew about the Wiesenthal Center was they were the Nazi hunters and
Right.
that they, up after the old Nazis. And so when I got the email, I was like, ooh, this should be interesting, but also a little scary. Like what, so I remember telling my girl at the time, I was like, I'm going to go meet with the Wiesenthal Center. Within 3 days, I believe, of them reaching out, Rick was on a plane to Detroit and met with me. Like that was that fast.
Wow. Wow.
So they're basically said when no national leader in the US has ever left ever in the movement and spoke out against it. So it was a pretty big deal. So Wiesenthal was on it within days, and
Were you nervous?
yeah, I was. Well, what I didn't finish that part, but yes,
Sorry, go ahead.
I'm sorry. I was getting distracted with the story, but I told my girl, I said, if I don't come back from this meeting, it means that I was kidnapped by the Mossad or something and taken to Israel to stand trial because I am meeting with the Wiesenthal Center. And
Wow.
and that was I say it tongue in cheek and I laugh about it now, but it was sort of like I was 99% sure that the meeting would be great, but there was that little 1% chance, like, well, wait a minute, what if, and I knew I hadn't committed any crimes or anything, but still, that was a little nervous, and I laugh about it now. But the funny part or the interesting part of that whole conversation after meeting Rick was at the end of the conversation, I said to him, well, it was really nice meeting you, and he goes, oh, we've met before. And no, I don't think so. I don't think so. And he goes, yeah, I think so. And then he rattled off a Christian identity gathering. It was a small local, like a
Mhm.
meet, not local, but it was a small meeting at the pastor's house. And he was there undercover.
Wow.
And
Wow.
So that was like, that blew my mind. I said, I didn't
Well,
even Wiesenthal did undercover stuff in the American scene, you know?
I had no idea about that either. So I'm learning something new from you.
Mhm.
Yeah. So what are some of the things that you do for them now?
So today, I do all kinds of things. Work with the Wiesenthal Center. I'm a speaker at Conscious Campus. And with Wiesenthal specifically, they have a program that goes to the schools, and it's called Combat Hate. And it's in different parts of the country. And I'm not, I do a follow-up to the Combat Hate program. So the students that have went through Combat Hate, I will go in and speak to those schools, as many of them as book us, and I will go in and talk with students at assemblies and hundreds and hundreds of students. I should have a number. It's probably thousands by now because just this week, I just got back from New York City, and some of those assemblies had a couple hundred kids, a few hundred kids, and some have had up 500 or 600 kids.
Uh,
So, and then I'm going back next week as well. So I've got a lot of those. So we do that. And so a lot of everything from sixth grade or fifth or sixth grade up through high school we'll meet with. And then also I do community talks like in New York City, a lot of the city council members will set up community talks, and those that are working with us, we'll go in and speak to their constituents and groups like that at different community centers or JCCs and different places like that. So do a lot of that with them. And I'm also listed as a speaker for their mobile museum of tolerance in Illinois, and now they're putting out more buses across the country, and there's one in Canada, at least one in Canada as well. So lots of good work the Wiesenthal Center is doing in education, because that's the key, just to stop people from radicalizing before they get to where I was, and education. So that's a big deal. I also
Was that,
work.
that yeah, sure, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, I was going to say I've also done some work with the OJJDP, which is the part of the Justice Department. It's the
Mhm.
Office of Juvenile Justice, and was one of just a handful of educators from around the country selected for this anti-bullying and anti-hate crimes initiative, a curriculum that was also. So I delivered some of those classes, did the training in DC with the Justice Office of Juvenile Justice Department, and then delivered in schools here around Detroit, and that should be. I'm not sure when it's going nationwide, but it should be, as far as getting into the schools and stuff like that.
Well, it's very admirable, and that was my next question about this, radicalization. Harassment of Jews and anti-Semitism has just exploded around the country right now. So in many areas of life, but predominantly on campuses, and it stems from an indoctrination, drilling into kids from a younger age, school kids, all the way up to college, that these people are bad. Your group was right wing, but they're predominantly, I see it up on the left right now, but they're two sides of the same coin. So what can be and what should be done to stem this or prevent this from happening in the future? Because it feels like we now have like an entire generation of kids almost lost to this hateful ideology unless something is done fast.
I agree, and it's the radicalization that we're seeing. It is two sides of the same coin, and it's very well stated. But I do see, and I don't want to minimize the danger from the extreme far right, but the what we're seeing on the extreme far left is going wild through the schools,
There's
and
no
it's,
doubt about that's where it's coming from. Yeah. Right.
yeah, that's a big danger right now, as far, especially on the anti-Semitism front, because
Mhm.
it's becoming so predominant, and it's almost to the point of being, dare I say it, socially acceptable. So
Right.
this is a horrific implication, and a lot of the students, when you're seeing, because we're following this as well, and I'm following it as well, and um, a lot of them don't even know why that they are being anti-Semitic, or why they hate, or they don't understand the causes. Or you have like what's going on in the Israel-Palestine war or conflict, whatever you want to call it. And there's people out there. You've got Gays for Palestine
Right.
and things like that. And these, it's like, okay, you believe in this cause, but do you know what
Oh,
Hamas does to gay people? Like, it's just so uh counterintuitive, and I don't get it. My biggest bone to pick with that is what Hamas did on October 7th, attacking civilians and using rape as a weapon, and killing unarmed civilians and elderly and women and children. It's even even in war, you can't do things like that. Those are war crimes. Those are crimes against humanity. It's unfeasible.
That's what I said. It's you said it yourself, and that's it. That it's become socially acceptable, which is terribly frightening. And that's unless something is done, it's terrifying to think of the future. So tell me a little about your memoir, which again I've read. I found it fascinating. I think it's an important read. I can see it being made into a movie, one day. What prompted you to write it?
I felt like it was important to write for a lot of reasons, but part of it is that I feel like there's been some other formers that have gotten out there and they've told their stories and stuff, but none of them have ever been in major leadership roles, and most had not been in the amount of time that I had, and so there was nothing in that sense. There was nothing from that, like a leader's perspective of how what some of the struggles were like. Not to minimize or diminish any of the foot soldiers or anybody else's stories, because every one of those stories is important, but it was just a much different angle, and then everybody's experiences are unique and different, and I felt like maybe this can help people. Maybe this is something, it can be a cautionary tale, something that you read it and it would help different people. It would help people like studying this stuff, like academics and psychologists and stuff like that, to understand the mindset, to maybe help for future de-radicalization programs. I felt like it could help from a public perception, public standpoint, not to get radicalized. These are the things that can happen to you. It's not glamorous. It's not a good thing. It hurts your family. It hurts everybody around you. It's not being patriotic. It's not being noble. It's a wrong trajectory. So I felt like it could help those people, and for the people that are already radicalized. I've had a lot of people. I've been contacted by law enforcement agencies and things like that to meet with young people that are being radicalized into these type of groups, because they specifically asked to speak with me. The young people that they've met with, like, is there anybody you would talk to, because they can't get through. They're not being reached because they're not understanding it or they're not identifying it. A lot of times I'll say, like with Alcoholics Anonymous or Narcotics Anonymous, you could have a doctor standing up there in front of a group of alcoholics saying, look, if you keep drinking, this is what it's going to do to your liver and your kidneys. And they might listen, but they might check out because it's not somebody that's went through what they're struggling with. Now, if you have an ex-alcoholic get up there and say, look, this is how I changed my life, everybody in that room is paying attention because they want to know, how did he do it? Because he was where we were. So that's sort of the other, alcoholism or drugs as a comparison, but it's not the same thing. But what I'm saying is for some of those that are radicalized, if they see that somebody else can do it, somebody they knew of at least, they could do it too. So I felt like that was an important element, because I've had a lot of people, tons of people reach out for help, and it's like they either knew me or they knew of me. Pretty much everybody. So during those times, so I felt like that was an important thing for them too, to kind of understand the story, and it doesn't just happen in the snap of a fingers, and there is some struggles to it. Originally, when I wrote the memoir, I thought, I'm just going to tell the story and stop there, and then I thought, oh, this is just bad. There has to be something good that comes out of this, because I didn't really want to talk about what all happened afterwards. And I thought, you know what? This has to be as transparent and honest as possible. And if it doesn't include that element, then it needs to go in the trash, because I don't want it to just talk about that time. So it talks about that time, and it gives that story, but then it has that redemptive arc at the end. It comes out in a good way.
Which is what makes the memoir. It really does. It's like I said, I've read it and I find it fascinating. I do hope that we will get to see it, because it's such a great story of redemption. Let me tell me a little bit about your organization, Beyond Barriers. What is it about, and what can people do to become involved?
So in 2020, I started a nonprofit called Beyond Barriers, and while I did not want to have anything to do with starting a new organization or anything like that, um, I was getting bombarded with so many inquiries and people reaching out for advice, help, and things like that. And I felt like I can't do this by myself. I can't keep up with it. So I needed to start an organization to help others disengage and de-radicalize and get away from that life. So put together a team. Daryl Davis is a part of it. There's some other formers that are part of it, a number of other experts in the field and things like that. And we just put together a team of volunteers that would help do this sort of thing. Now there is other organizations out there that do this kind of work, but I don't feel like their approach is the same. And I didn't really have a lot of interactions with many of them, so I felt like my journey out was incredibly difficult. It was, and it's always a struggle, I think, for anyone, but I felt like I didn't really have anybody I could lean on. I didn't have a support system other than my dad, a couple girlfriends, and literally, and you could count them on one hand, my support system. So, and I hesitated to lean on a lot of them because it's so stressful and it's like I didn't want to burden others with my struggles. So I felt like I didn't want anybody else to have to go through that and at least have somebody or some people there to kind of support them and walk with them. And nobody was banging down my door trying to bring me on to one of these counter extremism organizations. So I felt like if I couldn't do it alone and I wasn't being picked up by anybody else. So let's do this and let's do it the way that Daryl Davis did it and the way Dia Khan did it. And we created a program called relational dialogue, which is what we call it. And basically that's how we reach people. And it's not by telling them they're wrong, and it's not by belittling them or shaming them or anything like that. That kind of stuff, especially the shame and the guilt, that comes internally and it comes on their own. And if anybody's pushing that on them or projecting that on them, you will probably lose that person because they'll push back and things like that. So we know they're wrong. Society knows they're wrong, but they have to come to that realization. So, and even like with Daryl Davis, in the media and the news, it'll always say, well, Daryl Davis has de-radicalized 200 plus Klansmen.
Oh.
If you ask Daryl Davis will say, I de-radicalized no one. I gave them the tools to be able to do that themselves. I helped them. And that's the same way I look at it. It's like if you force somebody to change, that change isn't real. Real change comes from the heart and the mind, and they have to feel like they have to have done it themselves. We can aid them in that process, and we certainly do. And we give them the toolkit, but they have to do it because if they don't do it, it's not real. Like if you tell somebody, hey, man, you're going to jail if this happens, or your wife says, I'm leaving you if you don't do this, or you get these ultimatums, chances are that if the person does give in, it's not real, and they'll devolve, or they'll go back or things like that. It's just not real. It has to come from within. And if it comes from within, that change tends to be permanent. And that's the trajectory I've seen in the last 5 years working on these type of cases.
Beyond Barriers has a website. What's the website?
It's beyondbarriersusa.org.
Now, how can people follow you on social media?
Boy, I'm all over on social media. So I throw you the link tree maybe to put in the description.
I'm going to do that anyway. But
Okay.
just for the audio part, it's like, is it at on Twitter? Like, are you at Jeff Schoep?
I don't even have it in front of me, so I think
I'm going to put the links in the video anyway, so people can follow along there too.
But please, yes, follow me on social media.
Yes. Now, during our very first conversation, you told me that it's been Jewish people that have been among your biggest supporters, which I can totally see. When you see the way that the Jewish community has embraced you, do you stop and think how much of a 180 your life has become?
Every day, Jonathan, every day. And that's probably the hardest thing about it, and it's like another former a friend of mine, TM Garrett, he had asked me after speaking at the synagogue for the first time, he asked me a question afterwards and he says, do you feel better or worse about who you once were, or do you feel better or worse about the experience at the synagogue? And I said, oh my gosh, both. Better, because like I can't believe everybody was so kind and loving. I got more hugs in that synagogue than probably anywhere I'd ever been. And some of them were Holocaust survivors or families of survivors and things. And I thought, man, I didn't know how they would react. But worse about who I once was. Like that's where the guilt and all that kind of stuff comes in. And even now, with a lot of my friends being Jewish and things like that, it's surreal in a lot of ways, because it is a complete 180. And it's just so ironic that the people that I dehumanized and I felt were the enemy the most have been the most kind and the most embracing of my change, and saying some of the most and demonstrating some of the most beautiful things, and teaching me about the Jewish faith and things like Tikkun Olam, and spreading the work through the world. And there's a few other terms. The Jewish faith actually has quite a number of references, and the words are slipping my mind right now, but there's so many redemptive aspects to the faith, and it's been an incredible learning experience. And the way I explain it to the kids at the schools, especially the younger ones, is y'all remember opposite day, where you wear your clothes backwards and all that in elementary school? That's kind of how my life was, like I believed the opposite of and that's a hard thing to swallow. That's why for a lot of people, it's easier to stay entrenched when you realize how wrong you were, because it's a hard thing to admit you're wrong, especially
First thing is to admit it, right? Yeah. Jeff, I really want to sincerely thank you for coming today. I believe in redemption. I believe in second chances. And again, I've had nothing but good interactions with you. And like I said, from the very first moment I met you, you've been courteous and respectful. And I sincerely hope that your memoir finds its way onto shelves and people read it, because I think it's a good story. It's a fascinating story, and it's a worthwhile and necessary story for right now. So again, thank you for coming on.
Thank you so much, Jonathan.
Again, this has been, and a special thanks to Jeff Schoep. And please like, comment, and subscribe.
Thanks for tuning in to Did You Know, where all items used were strictly kosher.